electronic meeting. The physical meeting will be conducted at Midvale City Hall. However, participants can choose to participate via Zoom if necessary. Those participating in person are asked to wear a face mask covering both mouth and nose and to practice social distancing. This meeting is a workshop meeting. No public comment will be allowed during this meeting. We would like to open our meeting with the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Kate, will you please take a roll call vote?
Yes. Chair Tippett.
Here.
Vice Chair Anderson.
Here.
Commissioner Costello.
Here.
Commissioner Snow. Okay. Commissioner Erickson.
Here.
And Commissioner Benson.
Here.
And Commissioner Smallwood is excused tonight.
Okay, it looks like we just have one agenda item on our meeting, and that is the discussion of the 2021 legislative session, an update by Alex Murphy, Planning Director.
Good evening, everybody. Dustin, can we hear you? I don't know if we can hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, there you are.
Great.
Great, thank you. So tonight, I'm just going to go over several things that happened in the legislature this year. The session ended last March, and we've kind of been digesting the things that were proposed and adopted, and have been trying to make sense of what we need to do moving forward to respond to the adopted bills. So just to kind of recap what happened in the 2021 session, there were over 500 bills passed by the legislature. About 250 of those were tracked by the League of Cities and Towns. And there were a lot of topics considered in there, including things like state and local operations, law enforcement, criminal justice, public health, education, transportation, planning, etc. There were far more than 500 bills proposed. So there were many things that didn't make it out of the session or were considered and rejected. We're going to focus today on a few of the ones that impact us here in the planning department, particularly. So there's 5 bills in particular that were passed that we need to react to, and that means make changes in the zoning ordinance or other sections of city code. But I'm also going to go really briefly over bills that were passed that we don't need to do anything about, just so you can see the topics that were discussed or changed. And then some bills that didn't pass and interim topics, because those are things that we expect will come back again later this year or next year or beyond. So this whole discussion is really just a discussion between us as commissioners and staff. So feel free to chime in with any questions. The meeting will go as long as you want to sit here and talk about this. So we can move quickly or we can go in great detail. So the first bill that we'll need to make changes for is SB 201. This was a public notice amendment bill that basically just removed the requirement to publish notices for certain actions in the newspaper. Historically, the newspaper has been one of our required publication and notice sources, but around the beginning of this year, the big ones in Salt Lake County reduced their publication periods. So they were only publishing once a week or maybe twice a week. So when that happened, we had to scramble internally to figure out how to meet our notice deadlines and still publish in the paper. And the legislature was kind enough to remove that requirement. It is still in city code. So until we amend the notice ordinance or the notice requirements in city code, we'll have to continue publishing in the newspaper. That's on our list of things to tweak. Any questions on that one? That's easy. Second one's also pretty easy. This is a change to platting requirements that says that subdivision plats and surveyors must now work closer with water conveyance facility owners. This is your canals, your ditches, and similar facilities, requiring that they be shown on plats and that they get approval from those facility owners as they start making changes to those. There was already some requirement in state code for this, so this is really just modifying those standards. There was also a requirement to notify those facility owners when plats were happening, which we have been doing as city staff. They were revised slightly so that now we have to notify more people, and the waiting period has been changed slightly. But again, it's pretty basic, and we'll change this in our subdivision ordinance sometime later this year. The third through the fifth bills that I have on here are where we start getting a little more complicated. HB 82 is the first one. This is what we've been calling the ADU bill, or accessory dwelling unit bill. This bill has several provisions that take effect next week and more that take effect later this year. But the biggest one, the most I don't want to say urgent, but the most impactful is that it defines what an internal accessory dwelling unit is, and it requires them to be a permitted use in areas zoned primarily for residential use, in Midvale at least. It doesn't affect every city in the state, but it does affect us here in Midvale. So internal ADUs are ADUs that are in single family houses, part of either within the existing footprint or attachments to them. So you can see here, I'm going to move this. There we go. So you can see here's several kinds of ADUs. We have attached, above garage, in the basement, etc. We have already got language in city code that allows ADUs, but now we'll have to make some changes to it to modify the standards and the review process for them. Because what this says is it has to be a permitted use, and we are only allowed to regulate certain aspects of it. So we can, as part of this, put a notice on the title that allows us to pursue enforcement actions if we say we don't want these used as short-term rentals, as an example. And it does establish a new process for enforcement actions specific to ADUs. So required elements of this bill, as I mentioned, are we have to allow these as a permitted use in primarily residential zones. We cannot establish minimum size requirements, lot area, or frontage requirements for these ADUs. That's actually what a lot of ours are currently, is we have size requirement. We don't have lot area or frontage, but we do have size requirement. And then HOAs cannot prohibit ADUs. Some things we can regulate are that we can exclude up to 25% of residential areas in the city. We can prohibit IADUs or internal ADUs on lots under 6,000 square feet in size. We can impose some design standards, like requiring an extra parking space or requiring that they be on the same utility meters as the primary residence. We can prohibit the use of an IADU as a short-term rental if we record that notice on the title. And we can require a business license. There were some other changes in this bill that don't affect the planning elements of this process, like changes to the building code. There's still a requirement for a building permit when you do this kind of work. But these are the ones that we need to worry about here at Midvale specifically. We're not anticipating that, at least as the first proposal in response to this bill, that we're going to exclude any residential areas as we can under the optional language here. We already allow accessory apartments, which are a version of an IADU in every residential zone that we've got in the city. So our plan at this point is to take what we can regulate and just apply that to all the zones where these uses already exist. We may also expand some of these standards to apply to external ADUs or detached ADUs. Like, let me go back a slide. So detached ADUs are in an accessory building or in a detached garage or similar structure. So we may apply some of them to those types of structures, but we're not required to under this bill. Okay. Any questions there? Good. Next one is HB 98, Local Government Building Regulations. This is a bill that has two primary components to it. The first one is that it modifies building permit processes and requirements. It does allow third-party inspectors if certain requirements are met. So if a builder needs to get a building inspection and the city's not being cooperative with them or taking too long, then after certain thresholds are met, they can hire an external or an independent third-party inspector to do inspections. And if they go that route, that third-party inspector can also issue a certificate of occupancy. So the city doesn't necessarily have to issue that. There also is a set of application standards that establish minimum requirements that cities can impose for building permits. So basically, we can't go above these standards. We have to accept applications that have the state code requirements in them. The second aspect of this is a prohibition on the regulation of building design elements, which I'll have a list here in a second. Those are things that people typically use to address what I would call neighborhood concern topics. And like I said, we'll get to the list in a second. But by and large, with this bill, cities aren't allowed to impose those standards with few exceptions. Because cities no longer can impose those standards, removing those elements, sorry, my tongue got twisted up there for a second. In our moderate income housing plan, we could have used removal of building design elements as an approach to address moderate income housing needs. Because the state has preempted our ability to regulate those elements, they have also removed our ability to count that towards our moderate income housing plan. So we don't have to worry about that with our plan because we used that element, but it wasn't necessary to meet the minimum state requirements. So we don't have to worry about revising the plan to add more things into it because we didn't have enough before. But it's important to note that the state is really bullish on this topic. So the prohibited elements, the building design elements are things like exterior color and material, roof design, non-structural architectural ornamentation, which is not defined, location and design of windows and doors, including garage doors, number, type, and layout of rooms, minimum size, so it's minimum building size or unit size, rear yard landscaping requirements, minimum dimensions of units, and requirements to install fencing in the front yard. This applies, as the bill is written, to 1 to 2 family houses or dwellings and townhomes. So there is still a question about how that actually works in the real world that we're still trying to debate. But it could be everything up through townhomes on any project, or it could be just 1 and 2 family buildings, whether they're townhomes or not. The exceptions listed in this bill are for planned unit developments if the developer receives some benefit from the city. So that'd be like a density bonus or something that allows them to go above and beyond what's allowed naturally in the zone. A development agreement can also impose these standards. Historic districts that were registered before 2021 can still keep these elements. We don't have any of those in Midvale, so that doesn't really apply to us. Elements imposed by floodplain requirements can stay, as can those imposed by state wildland urban interface requirements. We don't really have any of those either in Midvale. Residential areas developed before 1950 can be accepted out, and water efficient landscaping and ordinances identifying defective materials can be accepted out from this. But by and large, the state is looking to limit our ability to impose standards on kind of your vanilla single family and 2 family residential development. One good thing about this bill is the governor vetoed it after it got passed by the legislature. But in his message vetoing it, he said the only reason he's vetoing it is because the floodplain standards were problematic for FEMA. And so he expects the legislature to address those issues, bring it back, and then it will probably pass either later this year or next year. So I've gone through this whole list because I expect we're going to have to address it in the near future. And our plan is to just address it up front and try and get ahead of the legislature in this respect. Okay, that's the second largest one. Any questions there? You folks on Zoom have any questions? Cool. Okay, the last one is HB 409, which is essentially LUDMA revisions. There's several pieces in here. It's a fairly large bill, actually. And we'll go through them piece by piece. So the first is there is now, as of next week, an annual training requirement for planning commissioners. There are new standards for development agreements and infrastructure improvements on residential streets. There's a new definition for substantial evidence in LUDMA, so that now there's an actual defined standard for that term, which we use when we make land use decisions. There's a requirement for conditional use permit standards to be objective. There's modifications to subdivision and lot line adjustment processes, and then some changes to the appeals process for certain decisions. So we'll go through this piece by piece. On the planning commissioner side, you must now complete 4 hours of training each year on being a planning commissioner. At least 1 hour has to be on LUDMA, so on the state code regarding land use development. 1 hour can come from attending at least 12 meetings in a calendar year. So between those two, you're halfway to the goal. And then the remaining hours have to come from things like seminars, conferences, in-house training, whatever we can use to show that you're continuing your education and maintenance of that experience as commissioners. So we have not identified quite yet how we're going to do this, but it'll probably be a combination of in-house trainings and making conference options available to you as we find out about them. The league will probably also be putting together some training sessions that we can either do virtually or have them come in and do in a meeting. The other element of this is that first hour of LUDMA training for new commissioners has to be completed before they sit for their first meeting. So when we have new commissioners come in, before they can sit for any meeting, they have to do this training. And so we'll have to make sure to either do something for them face-to-face or set up something that they can do remotely or virtually from home. We do have to track this on an annual basis. I'm not sure if there's a reporting requirement yet, but if there's not, I'm sure somebody will be asking about it. So we're just going to get out ahead of this one too and try and figure out how we keep track of everything. Any questions there? Okay. On development agreements have been a hot topic in the judicial system over the last few years, and in some of the political realm too. So the legislature has been working for the last year or two on updated standards for development agreements. So now there are new terms. It's a defined process in LUDMA, as opposed to just being a single phrase that was referenced by everybody. There's kind of 2 tracks put together for development agreements. If an agreement implements an existing regulation, it's an administrative action and doesn't necessarily require action by the legislative body. If a development agreement conflicts with the adopted ordinance, so it could be imposes standards above and beyond what the ordinance says or modifies those standards for some purpose or another, then it has to go through the same process that a text amendment would go through. So it'll have to come before the Planning Commission and then go to council. So we don't try to have development agreements do that. So I'm not sure how many will have come to the Planning Commission, but as we go through the text amendment process, we're going to define a new application process and procedure for this. So you'll have an opportunity to provide input on what sorts of things you do want to see, and then the council will ultimately make that decision. Development agreements can also not be the only option available to develop land. So there has to be an option for property owners and builders to develop that ground without a development agreement, which means we'll probably have to change some of our zones because we do have that requirement in a couple of them. There's similar to the development agreements, there's a new section for roadway improvements. This is fairly minor and we're still trying to work out exactly how it impacts us. But what it says is that on single family residential streets where a low impact development or low impact design standard is imposed, which is basically every single family residential street at this point, the pavement width cannot exceed 32 feet. Our pavement width standards are less than that already, so I don't think we have to worry about that one. And streets where we require more than 32 feet aren't residential streets anyway. So I'm still kind of struggling to see how that affects us, but there is an additional piece in here that says cities must adopt standards for emergency vehicle access and turnarounds, so into their ordinance. So we will have to put in standards for those rather than relying on fire code or building code or engineering standards like we have been historically. So we'll see some changes for that element. On the subdivision and lot line side, there have been some changes to the definitions and processes in there. So there were some new exceptions added to the subdivision definition that now will allow certain land divisions without city approval. There are particular requirements that they have to meet, like they have to be done in anticipation of future development, and they have to have certain notes on the document that's recorded to affect those divisions. So we will need to figure out how we want to respond to those because that's now allowed under state code. Someone can just record the deed that says this land is divided if they put the right notes on it. There's also a modification to lot line adjustment that says that has a similar process. So lot line adjustments do not require city approval with certain exceptions if we adopt them into city code. So those exceptions are like if there's a house on one of the lots, we can require a review. But if there's no house on the lots, then they can just be recorded. If a lot line adjustment does violate the zoning ordinance and we find out after the fact, we can withhold or delay approvals until it's fixed. That can be very challenging, especially if they are different owners. Trying to bring multiple owners in to coordinate one of those things can be quite the challenge. And then for subdivisions, similar to the water conveyance facility bill I mentioned earlier, if a subdivision does not identify and preserve water and sewer easements, then we cannot approve it. So we have to show that there's water and sewer connections, or at least easements on these bills. And then perhaps even bigger than the land divisions without city approval, there is now a limitation or a prohibition on the city regarding future land use regulations. After a subdivision is recorded, the city cannot impose new land use regulations for 10 years. The way that it's worded, I don't expect that it will stay exactly like this for long, because it says no land use regulations can be applied. So if a developer asks for a change, we can't do it. So I think we'll see some changes to that one, but this does mean we have to start figuring out how to track ordinance versions over time and associate them with particular subdivision plats. So that's a pretty big administrative burden on our side that we're going to have to address, but it doesn't necessarily, that piece doesn't require a code modification. Okay, let's just make sure I got everything. The substantial evidence standard is fairly basic. It's just a new term so that the courts can refer back to it when we make our decisions. As far as I can tell, we already satisfy that requirement. We may bring it into our ordinance too, just to be consistent with state code, but I don't see that it's going to change anything about our approach. The objective standards to conditional use permits is one that we'll probably need to revisit at length at some point in the near future, because our standards are not perhaps as objective as we would like them to be. So we'll have to revisit that and probably make some tweaks to our general conditional use permit standards. That's a pretty big project. So I'm still trying to sort out when and how we do that. And then for the appeal process, the clarification is basically that legislative decisions go to referendums, administrative decisions go to hearing officer. Okay, that's the bills that passed that we need to worry about. Are there anything I can clarify or clean up for you on
I
this?
just wanted to make one comment.
Do you want to speak into it?
I thought it was really quite interesting. And the one part of the one bill saying that they couldn't rent it out for less than 30 days. I know some people in Sandy that have really run into problems like that with skiers,
Mhm.
especially during ski season. So I was glad to see that as part of this, because I know in certain neighborhoods in Sandy up on the East Bench, it's really become quite a problem
Yeah,
with skiers coming in and renting. So I was glad to see that.
that is where we don't have to do that. We
Mhm.
can. I'm not sure what we're going to end up doing with short-term
Uh-huh.
rentals, honestly. We don't allow them currently anywhere in the city,
Mhm.
so we can fall back on that. But there was some talk in this, well, one of the bills that I probably won't dive into a whole lot, but one of the bills that didn't pass was a further restriction on the city's ability to enforce prohibitions on short-term rentals. It actually said cities cannot enforce them and they cannot spend money enforcing them. So it essentially would have meant that short-term rentals are allowed everywhere
Mhm.
as a result.
So
That-
what about like Airbnbs?
Those are short-term rentals. So
Well, then we do have some in our city.
yes, we do. We have some,
Mhm.
but we currently cannot pursue an enforcement action based on somebody posting their property
Oh.
on a website like that. So what, in essence, what I think we would have to do is actually go there and stay the night and
Ah.
then enforce on it. And so that's why the bill was proposed that would have said you can't spend money to enforce the ordinance.
Oh, I see.
Because I'm sure that some cities have started doing that. We haven't. We just don't issue them licenses or anything. But we'll see. That's a topic of discussion that our city manager, Matt Dahl, has been talking about for at least 2 years now, is how do we deal with short-term rentals? And we've gone everywhere from keep it where it's at to just allow them. So who knows where it'll end up. Other bills that passed, I don't necessarily need to go through all of these, but I just wanted to give you kind of a list so you could see the breadth of what we are following when these legislative sessions happen. But a couple I'll talk about. Voter referendum amendments came as a result of some of the referenda that have happened over the last couple of years. It slightly modifies the process that initiatives have to go through. I haven't seen one happen in Midvale in I don't know how long, so it may not affect us a whole lot, but if anybody ever does attempt to overturn a legislative decision, then that bill will matter. SB 164, hold on, let me just pull up my notes here. Okay, so SB 164 is exciting because it's a bill that is pushing for more affordable housing, or better housing affordability rather. And it allows local governments to contribute publicly owned property towards projects that incorporate affordable housing. So normally if we wanted to transfer property, we would have to go through a process to vacate or surplus it, depending on the type of property it is. This one will allow us to bypass parts of that process if the project includes affordable housing, which is cool if you have a lot of property that could be used for that. We don't really have a lot of property in Midvale for that, but it's a neat option that is now available to us. The other one, HB 244, is exciting because it is a huge investment into transportation funding, and it includes both vehicle and active transportation funding options, and transit as well. So we should hopefully, as a result of that bill and some of the other efforts that have come out of WFRC and other transportation planning organizations, have a lot more money coming into this area, which is good because we have a bike plan coming up that I really hope we can build out soon. And that'll be one of the sources that we can use to pay for it. Let's see. HB 433. I had all these in the right spot, and then I moved my computer and they all moved around. Okay, this is, so HB 433 is kind of the same thing, more money available to transportation funding as again, so that's why it's bolded here. And then the rest of these are things that we watch, but don't necessarily need to react to from the city code standpoint. Several of these will affect things like the RDA and how the city makes other funding decisions, but they're not going to affect us here so much. There were a few bills worth pointing out that were not passed. There's, again, like 2 lists here. The ones that I've bolded are the ones that we care about the most. HB 401 was a bill that would have limited further our ability to charge fees, and it would have imposed a significant burden on us to track how our fees were, how they came in and how they went out. And so we'd have to report back annually about how much money we received and how much money we spent. So we're grateful that that one didn't pass because it would have been a lot of extra man hours to deal with. SB 61 and SB 144 were bills that would make changes to billboards. One of them would essentially allow billboards just to do just about anything, just about anywhere without city approval. So that didn't pass. Another one would have allowed them to convert existing billboards to electronic billboards with very little city input. So there was a lot of back and forth on those bills, and they didn't end up passing this session, but we anticipate that they'll come back in the very near future. SB 221, I mentioned briefly earlier, short-term rental amendments. That was the one that would have basically made it impossible for us to enforce short-term rental prohibitions. So in the interim session and upcoming sessions, there's a few things that we expect will come about. HB 98, since it was vetoed, we expect it will come back real quick once the floodplain issues are addressed. Billboards also we expect will come back real quick, and continually billboards come up every session, And so we are regularly discussing them. Fees will probably come back. I imagine it will be a slightly watered down version of the bill that didn't pass this session. Same with short-term rentals. Inclusionary zoning was a topic that came up. That's the policy where you mandate affordable housing as opposed to just allow it. So requiring a certain number of units be affordable is an inclusionary zoning approach. There was one of the bills had an inclusionary zoning clause in it that was removed before it was adopted, so we expect it will come back. And then public improvement districts are a topic that was discussed, I think, at great length this session, and one that our community development director has investigated a lot as well. And it's essentially another funding source for public improvements. So it works similar to how the RDA functions with the reimbursements to developers, but it's somewhere between the developer building it and the city building it. And that's all. There's a lot that happened. So we have a lot of work to do behind the scenes. We'll have at least, I haven't decided exactly how we'll do this, but text amendments for all 5 of those major bills I mentioned coming back to the Planning Commission and then the council. But if there's anything I can help clarify at this point, or I don't want to say pontificate. Anything that you're interested in knowing, like how we're going to approach these or other topics related to this, I'd be happy to answer them.
Alex,
Mhm.
it's Robin. On that LUDMA,
Yeah.
why don't we all just do it? Like bring somebody in and that way you could track it easier. We could all just do it, even though some have already done it. And that way you'd be able to
I went too far.
track all of us doing it, the requirement for us. And we could just do it like one evening, easy peasy while we're just sitting there, maybe, huh?
That's probably how we'll handle the LUDMA training, with the exception of new commissioners, because new commissioners will have to get it before they can sit for a meeting, and we have to do it annually. So unless you want to have new commissioners wait after they're appointed to start.
Right.
So
But maybe the broad brush would be to just do one for all of us right now, those that are new-ish. That
Yep,
way we
yep.
cover all of us, and then you could keep track of it, I think, a little bit easier that way. Just a suggestion, whatever you think.
I think that's a good suggestion.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Robin.
We can just do a.
And
one big
I think
meeting.
we'll do that for the LUDMA for sure, and then we'll probably come up with some other topics to do the other hours of training with and treat it similarly. So
Sounds good.
in my mind, we'll probably start having training sessions at least once a quarter, so that we can try and split it out over the course of the year. Because not every commissioner attends every meeting, we might need to make some of those available as kind of one-offs or recordings or in some other fashion, so that if you miss a meeting where a training session is held, you can still do it later. And then we do have the Utah chapter of the APA puts together conferences every spring and fall that we have in the past budgeted money for commissioners to attend. So we can do that. And the league will probably have some recorded and in-person trainings that we can do too. So I'm hoping that 4 hours is not a huge burden.
Well, one of those hours would get attending 12 meetings.
Yeah,
So
so it's really
that's-
like 3 hours.
yeah,
Is
it's not
not a
terrible.
huge burden. Just don't be like Zach and miss a meeting.
Well,
Yeah, the league really do good,
Mhm.
good sessions like that, because I've been to a lot of those.
Yeah, and I think they're going to have to just start doing more,
Yeah.
because I mean,
Oh, yeah.
let's see, the requirement applies to every city above a certain size,
Mhm.
and I want to say it affects something like 82 cities that have to do this out of 200 and something across the state.
But I can certainly see that in today's world where this is something that needs to be.
Any other questions or topics?
So on the square foot minimum requirements.
Uh-huh.
So we
On the-
can't say that your house has to be bigger than 600 square feet.
So do you mean on HB 98 with
Uh-huh.
general design elements? Yeah, if assuming this is all with the caveat that we're assuming it will pass soon, but again, it was vetoed, so it won't apply next week. But yes, if and when it does pass, we won't be able to say your house has to be a certain size. We don't now. Other cities do, but we don't in Midvale.
And then the accessory dwellings, how do they override HOAs?
That's
Good
outside of my
question.
area of expertise. So maybe Garrett can answer it.
So HOAs are created by the state by statute. And so the state can overrule them by statute as well. I mean, technically, the state could get rid of HOAs if they wanted to.
Did you catch that?
Mm-hmm.
Does anybody else have concerns over accessory dwellings, or is it just me?
Well, it kind of looks like we don't have a lot of choice. So
Yeah, the
it kind of looks like that's been determined for us.
Yeah, I'm a lot worried. I'm not gonna lie.
So if you have a garage and you wanted to put something on top of it and it's detached, is that restricted then?
so
That's what it looks like.
yeah, this bill only mandates that we allow ADUs inside of single family buildings, inside of single family homes. So if it's a detached garage, we can do whatever we want with it. Our current code says you can have an ADU in a detached building if it meets certain setbacks, including a setback from the house and the property line, and then it cannot be a second story building. So you could do a 1-story garage conversion, but you could not put it on top of a garage. If it's attached, like you can see in this
Right.
left option, that's an option as long as it's attached to the house, and we cannot impose a size limit on that ADU. So it kind of functions like it's almost a de facto duplex bill because there's no size limit. So you could do a 50-50 split between an ADU and a primary unit. The one difference is we can impose owner occupancy requirements. So we can require that the owner occupy one of the units. I don't know that we can specify which unit anymore, but we can say they have to live in the building and then they can rent out the other unit, but they cannot rent out both.
What about like heights and stuff? Does that still?
For this one, it's still all subject to the same standards that the underlying zone would have. So in our SF1 zone and SF2 zones, you'll still have to meet the setbacks and the height standards. Even if you convert part of that building, or say you convert a garage to an ADU, you'll still have to meet parking requirements. So you'll still have to have the off-street parking. So we can impose some requirements, but the ones that we have used historically are half gone at this point. Or will be, rather. All of these bills, with the exception of the ADU standards, will take effect next week. The ADU standards will take effect in October.
So Alex, let's say there's a flag property. There's a house in the front, a detached garage somewhat back, but it's a 2 driveway. And then they have a huge garage workshop in the very back.
Mhm.
How do they make it so that you can have rentals? Do you just tear everything down and start over, or do you? I mean, there's plenty of parking. That wouldn't be an issue. Driveway, any of that is already in place, but there's 2 useless shops, a garage, 2-car garage, and then a big shop.
So that situation is not covered by this bill,
Oh,
but
good.
the current code does allow, the current city code allows ADUs in certain circumstances in that kind of building.
Okay.
So our code says today, if you do a detached ADU, it has to be at least 10 feet from the property lines and at least 6 feet from the house. And then there's a size limit based on the accessory building limits.
Okay.
So we can keep all of that.
Okay, great.
And I think my plan right now is to ask the council how they feel about modifying external ADUs or detached ADUs like that. If they're open to it, then we'll probably remove some of the requirements. Like there's a size limit in there right now that says external or detached ADUs can't be over 600 square feet. And so we might just take that out and use the blanket accessory building limit that already applies to every detached building.
Oh, right.
We keep the owner occupancy and the parking standards and everything like we would for an internal ADU. Or maybe it's somewhere in between. Like it can be larger than 600 square feet, but not the full size of what's allowed on the property. So we still have to work through some of those details, and we'll bring them back to you before they end up in front of the council. So this one is just inside of the single family house. Anything else?
I don't see any other questions or comments. We can probably go ahead and move on to our agenda item 2, which is upcoming meetings and projects. And Alex, you're there, so you
Yeah.
can continue.
So I'll just hang out. So we're obviously at the end of April. We have a regular meeting scheduled for May 12th, but the only item that I have even possibly tentative on that agenda is a discussion about the residential planned unit development topic that we went over a couple months back. So I wanted to get the commission's feelings about how much they want to hold a meeting that week and how much they want to have a discussion on that topic, because we would like to continue moving that process forward if we can. If you want to have another discussion on it, we can schedule it for a meeting, or we can start, if you don't have any thoughts, or if you want to have one-on-one conversations with us about that change, we can.
Now, I'm sorry, what was that again? What was
So we talked, I want to say it was in January, about residential planned unit developments. This was replacing the master plan development language.
Yeah.
It was at that point just a discussion where I and the rest of us staff presented a concept to you that would replace our master plan development language. We also took it to the council, and I'll be doing one-on-one meetings with council members over the next week or two. And my intent was to bring it back to the Planning Commission for a second discussion so that you could give me more feedback before we started codifying it or putting it into what we could adopt as an ordinance. If you don't feel like that's helpful, I can jump straight to putting it into a codifying version, which means that we won't need to hold a meeting on May 12th. If you want to have a discussion and go over that topic some more, then we will probably want to at least have that on the 12th so that we don't delay that process any more than we already have. So this is where I need input that lets me know how you want to proceed.
I personally would rather have you put something together and then bring it to us instead of having another discussion about it. I think that's a better starting point for us.
Well, I did last time send out a summary of what it would look like. So my plan was to update that summary based on the feedback that we heard from the Planning Commission and the council, and then present the revised summary before putting it into a code version. I can send out that summary by email if you just want to take a look. And then
Have you had feedback from council members
some, yeah.
so that you can stick that in the summary also?
I probably won't call out who said what, but
Well,
yeah.
no, that's okay, but just the information.
Yeah. So I've already started a revised summary, and I've called out what the changes are in there. And
So are we saying we wouldn't meet and then wait until it's all put together and then so we can vote? Is that what we're talking about?
that's the option. We can either have a discussion on the summary with changes, or I can push it to a version that's ready for a vote. I mean, you don't have to make a vote on it
Yeah,
the first time
but
it's presented, but
That's
we can take
another
it to the
discussion
public
day
hearing.
too, that we could,
So basically I can schedule it for a discussion on the 12th, or I can schedule it for a public hearing probably in June. That's kind of the.
Less is more,
Okay.
for sure.
Okay. I'm
anyone
hearing.
else have any feelings about that?
Strong feelings about it is what she's asking.
All right.
Just,
Well,
Candace, I think having just the email would be helpful.
okay.
I don't know if you've sent it. I may have missed it.
I haven't sent an updated email.
Okay.
Yet, so
That would be helpful.
what I'll do then is over the next week or two, I'll finish my one-on-ones with the council members, incorporate their feedback, and then I'll send an email out to the commission, and we can schedule one-on-one discussions if you want to talk some more about it. And I'll give you a couple weeks to do that.
Okay.
And then if I don't hear anything, or if it If it doesn't seem like anybody has significant concerns, then I'll just move straight to the public hearing. And if I get feedback from you individually that makes it sound like a discussion would be worthwhile, then we'll put it up for another discussion. Not on May 12th. So either way, at that point, we won't have a meeting on May 12th unless some unforeseen event arises that we have to schedule it. May 26th, we are going to have a special meeting. We have a text amendment and 14 condo plats that we need to talk about. So I don't think I'll spend a whole lot of time talking in that meeting because the plats are all for the Homes project and they're fairly simple, but we have to get through them one at a time because of the way that they came into us. So I guess buckle up for a lot of motions in that meeting. And then June, looks like we have a meeting. We will have the first meeting in June, but I don't have anything yet for the second meeting, so we may or may not have that one. As far as other projects are concerned, things you might be interested in knowing, the Zions building is almost at its 6-story height limit. So they're holding a topping off ceremony tomorrow morning. So they should have probably the first pieces of the 6th floor up tomorrow. So if you want to go take a look and see how tall it is, it's pretty neat building. In fact, over the last week, it's really jumped.
It has.
in
I
height.
drove by it today and I was shocked at how
Yeah.
much it's changed in
Yeah.
a couple weeks.
I have a time lapse I have access to a time lapse camera for it. I'll see if I can send it out to you guys and you can see how things change over several days. It can do like a week, 2 weeks, or a month. But it's kind of fun to watch all the vehicles move around and the building pop up. And then let's see. The Midvale Mills project was approved by the council earlier this month. So they'll be coming back with their first phase probably in June as well at this point. And I don't think I have anything else. Any other questions or things you want me to investigate?
Alex, on the buildings on 7230, those lovely containers stacked on top of each other. That is the ugliest thing we ever approved. It is so ugly and it doesn't match anything there. It's really disappointing. Are they doing anything with the roof or is it just flat?
It's just flat.
Oh my gosh, that is the ugliest thing ever. I'm glad I didn't have to vote on it.
Well, I can tell you that project is also one of the reasons why this RPUD discussion is so important.
Yes. Really disappointing when you drive past that. It just looks atrocious right there. It doesn't fit in. It's really bad. It's too bad.
That the RPUD topic wouldn't have affected that project because of the way they went through their approvals. They didn't do it as a master plan development, but once we get a good feel for what standards we want for larger projects like that, then we can start trickling them down or watering them down and applying them to other projects. So that's where I mentioned earlier, we have to have objective conditional use permit standards. So we're going to have to figure out how we define the type of building that we want to see on a project like that one. And that's something to keep in mind. So we can, and at some point, hopefully when we get a break, we can start working on it. Okay. If nothing else, I'll give it back to you, Chair.
Okay, well, if there's no other comments, I'll take a motion to adjourn.
I'll make a motion to adjourn at, 6:49.
Any opposed to adjourning? We are now adjourned.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.